I was in denial that I would reach this point in this series, if I'm honest. And I can't even begin to tell you how hard this is to write, read, and edit. The events that occurred between 1932 and 1933 in Ukraine are some of the darkest to ever occur in our collective human history. The extent of the Holodomor was largely in the West unknown, all the way up until the end of the Soviet Union, with the only evidence being anecdotal or first-hand accounts, which quite often just won't listen to. The people who survived it, knowing better than to try and fight the state, who had just killed 1 in 10 of their people, even knowing where the mass graves were would get you killed. The grave diggers in Kiev are evidence enough of this alone, rounded up and shot on trumped-up charges of treason. Well, the people who survived it, there aren't many of them left. The Holodomor may have started due to bad policy, that much is likely. The vicious collectivization at its core. However, the reality that so many try and deny, in part due to the Kremlin's policies, is that the actions of the leadership in Moscow, through Russification, knowingly committed a genocide. I didn't know what to write for the Holodomor, and it took me a long time to sit down to write it. Then I deleted it, wrote it again, deleted it, wrote it again, and deleted it. I've now reached the point where I'm happy to make this video. Happy being a strong word, where I'm ready to make this video. And I am happy that the information that I'm giving you is accurate as can be without access to the Moscow archives, of course, and it is the truth. I recommend if you're ever in Kiev to go to the Holodomor Memorial. It costs 100 hryvnia to get in. It's nothing huge, it's nothing fancy, but it will give you perspective. It will give you a lot of perspective, and will tell you the stories which we have forgotten, such as the man who went out of his way to feed children, who was then beaten to death and killed by the state because he dared try and save children's lives. It would teach you about the middle-class families who, as a way to try and hold on to something from their lives before the Soviets came, kept a shawl, a simple shawl. It will tell you how in 2022 and 2023, when under occupation, a woman in the East would make vyshyvanka and bury them in jars so that one day Ukrainians' culture would survive even if the state itself didn't. It's a hard topic. I've written about the Holocaust and it's not this hard. There is something particularly vicious about knowingly starving children to death. This is not going to be a happy video. This was not going to be a funny video. But you should watch it. And if you have the gall to go into the comments to say that it was all made up, you are not human.
One of the great challenges of historians is how do we accurately put history into scale? Anyone who has sat next to a tank from the Second World War or seen up close a fighter jet will be able to understand this. They are a lot bigger than we can generally imagine or generally we think in our heads. So too is the scale of understanding the size of crowds, or in our case, victims. The estimated deaths are anywhere between 2 and 10 million for what we are about to discuss. We will never know the exact figure. However, a team of Ukrainian demographers have reduced the amount through cross-checking sources and deduced that the amount is around 3.9 million in about a year. 1 year, 3.9 million. Now that is just a number to many people upon hearing it. Our minds don't really comprehend it. And that's through no fault of our own. We are, after all, humans. We don't regularly think about what 3.9 million bodies look like. So to put this in perspective, towards the end of this video, I intend to leave 39 seconds blank, in silence. Take a look at this photo. This is the Melbourne Cricket Ground, Australia's biggest stadium, and it seats 100,000 people. I want you to keep this image in mind, screenshot it even. Every second that passes during the sequence stands for the amount of people you see in this image, each person with an individual story, a family, loved ones, friends. Every single one gone in a year. That is the scale of the genocide that was enacted upon the Ukrainian people in the 1930s over the course of a mere 12 months. But how? And more importantly, why? To understand the Holodomor and why and how it occurred, we must first travel back in time a little bit. Back to where we left off with the establishment of the Ukrainian People's Republic in the waning days of the First World War. On the 11th of November 1918, everything changed for Ukraine in a train carriage just outside of Paris. The German army, with its back broken by the 100 Days Offensive, and facing imminent collapse at home after 4 years of bloody war, surrendered to the Entente. The end of the hostilities overnight crushed the very hope of Ukrainian statehood as German and Austrian troops critical of the defence of the new country left to return home to their broken nations. On the 15th of December, troops loyal to Vinicenko, the former head of the Rada before the Bolshevik invasion in which he was removed from power, entered Kiev, and the Ukrainian People's Republic was born. The Bolsheviks now looked west at an almost defenceless Ukraine, rich with industry and resources, and they decided that perhaps it was time to try again. But, now this was a big but, the end of the war managed to, for the first time since the days of the Cossack hetmanates, unite the West and East, as the Western Ukrainian People's Republic declared its independence from the shattered remains of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, spurred on by their nationalistic ideals that were fostered by the Habsburgs during their rule. The Western Ukrainians and the Eastern Ukrainians came together, and they formed a treaty. The Habsburgs, though, they had helped foster the Ukrainian identity in the West in order to subject their Polish subjects, and now the division between the two groups had boiled over into outright hostility. The Habsburgs failed to divide the territories between Poles and Ukrainians, and the Poles began to claim the entire region. But the Ukrainian nationalists were faster, and on the 1st of November 1918, before the armistice had even been signed, they managed to seize the city of Lviv, the great city in the west named for the son of King Daniel of Ruthenia all those years ago. They declared their new state in Lviv that day, but the Poles fought back, conquering the city 20 days later. The Western Ukrainians, led by Ivan Petrushevich, moved to Ternopil, and then to Ivano-Frankivsk. It was the beginning of the long and bloody Ukrainian-Polish War. On December 1st, the two Ukrainian republics united, declaring a single state. The Western Ukrainians, backed by a strong army of battle-hardened men under the Austrian Kaiser during the war, now were backed for the very first time by the entirety of Ukraine, united together as one state. But this was just the beginning of a shattered dream, long since relegated to the history books. Although they had lost Lviv, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic had managed to establish firm control over its territory, forming a capable administrative government, backed by its well-trained and highly disciplined army. This was, though, not as powerful as a force as the numbers alone might have you believe, and in 1919, when the Polish army under General Josef Haller von Hallenberg invaded, 60,000 strong, some 85,000 Ukrainian soldiers met them, attempting to hold the rivers as the Poles surged forward. But these men were simply not well equipped enough to withstand such an invasion. There were some serious problems within the two states, as the Glissiers found little common cause with the more left-wing and central and eastern Ukrainians, preferring instead to focus on what they perceived as the real fight against the Poles. Meanwhile, though, in the east, the Bolsheviks were overrunning the country, and in the south, the white movement under Denikin was surging forwards. So the eastern Ukrainians, and really well central as well, in Kyiv, saw their threat as coming from the east and the south, with the Poles as an ally, not an enemy, while the western Ukrainians saw the Poles as an enemy, and those in the east and south as an annoyance more so than an enemy. Ukraine, simply put, was under siege in every direction. In the west, Poland; in the north and the east, the Bolsheviks; in the south, the whites, and the two Ukrainian states could not agree on who the enemy of their enemy was to be a friend, who could in that moment be their friend, who would then be their enemy the next day. For the Galicians, allying themselves with the White Army seemed like the best possible course of action, but the thought of the Easterners allying with the Whites was abhorrent, and they saw the Poles as a better ally. Parts of the Ukrainian state ignored both of these groups and favoured alliance with the Reds against the Poles and the Whites. Division was above all the order of the day, and in this newly declared republic, something would have to give, and give soon. In 1919, the dream of Ukraine would be destroyed, not with a bang but with a whimper, as typhus tore through the entire region, shattering the formations of the Rada. The eastern Ukrainians wouldn't be able to again rally a force large enough and disciplined enough to stand against its enemies, and it would fall apart, divided and destroyed through infighting. Meanwhile, in the west, the Galicians would go down swinging, outnumbered and outgunned against enemies with no support coming from any direction whatsoever. Many of the Galicians would make a deal with the whites, while other Ukrainians would make deals with the Poles, who by this point were advancing with the sole goal of re-establishing the power that once was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As 1919 gave way to 1920, the Ukrainian armies left the field, and with them went Ukrainian statehood as a physical entity. But for the Ukrainians, their brief taste of freedom would linger. Lenin himself admitted that in order for the Bolsheviks to succeed, they above all needed Ukraine for its resources, and of course its industry. In 1919, they tried to enforce their rule at the tip of bayonets in the heavily Russified cities, and this largely worked, but as the Reds made their way into the countryside, they discovered very quickly that the locals were not at all willing to give up their livelihoods to yet another foreign invader. The Reds initially attempted to accommodate these people, promising the positives of revolution, but with the other hand, they stole food and pushed their way through the locals as nothing more than another group of conquerors, banging on the gates of Europe. This, along with the White Army pushing, led to the loss of Ukraine for the Bolsheviks, but Lenin, being a pragmatic leader, gave the order to return, but not under the banner of the Russian Soviets, rather under the banner of the Ukrainian Soviets, pushing aside Russification for cultural accommodation in order to achieve wider revolution. The general idea was that the local Ukrainians could be, well, Ukrainian, provided of course they toe the party line. This strategy won the Reds a significant part of Ukraine, including the radical leftists in Kyiv, and worried about their success, the Poles under Pilsudski would surge forward, supported by the remnants of the Ukrainian forces from the east who had declared their support for the Polish cause. The Polish-Ukrainian army would enter Kyiv in early May, the idea being that they could form a Ukrainian buffer state to prevent invasion from the Bolsheviks in the east, but a rapid counterattack by Soviet cavalry forced them back, in a disorderly and rapid route to Lviv. An unknown commissar by the name of Stalin was determined to take the city, in order to make a name for himself, but he came across incredibly stiff resistance as the city held out, Eastern Ukrainians and Poles standing side by side, street by street. The defenders of Lviv held, and due to this, Stalin was unable to support the Soviet advance on Warsaw, and at what has been dubbed the Miracle on the Vistula, the Red Army was broken and it fled east, with a peace deal signed soon after, establishing that Galicia and Podolia would now be inside the new Polish state. Stalin would not forget this, nor would he forget how strong the feeling of nationalism and national identity was in Ukraine. But for now, Soviet attention was on the fight with the White Army. See, while Stalin was eating rocks attacking Lviv, the Red Army would turn south and smash into the White Army, which buckled under its offensive, retreating south through the steppe and into Crimea. General Wrangel, the white general in charge, realized very quickly that his situation was simply untenable, and Wrangel fled to Istanbul, leaving 50,000 men behind who were then cut down in a Red Terror as the Soviets cemented their position as the rulers of eastern and southern Ukraine. In 1921, the official peace treaty was signed in Riga, and Ukraine, the country in which was divided by two countries in 1914, now found itself broken and split between Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and of course, the newly formed USSR. Although the experiment with statehood failed, the ideal of a single Ukrainian state was now stronger than ever, and as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Ukraine became the largest ethnic group in Europe without a state of its own. That feeling was not going away anytime soon, and now Lenin was gone. In his place rose none other than Joseph Stalin. Each of the four governments that now controlled a part of what is today Ukraine took a different approach on how to deal with the burgeoning population of Ukrainians that actively sought independence and self-determination. Eastern Europe at the time, really along with the majority of the continent, found itself torn between two competing ideologies, namely communism and nationalism. And this is a conflict that crossed international borders every single day. For the Ukrainians, the line between the two, communism and nationalism, well, it started to blur, immensely so. See, this is where we come to an interesting point that not a lot of people realise, and that is that nationalism well, it's not always right-wing, not in the way you may think in the 21st century. For the Ukrainians, nationalism was not a case of racial supremacy, not like Nazi Germany. Rather, it was a case of a desire for a nation-state, kind of like the modern Scottish nationalism. At its core, it's not a right-wing ideology, but it jumps across the whole spectrum. Of course, nationalism and communism, well, they make for some strange bedfellows, and quite often they are at complete odds with each other, particularly when you consider the concept of worldwide worker solidarity and revolution, that is supposedly at the core of what was supposed to be the Soviet Union. In reality, the workers' paradise would prove with hindsight to be nothing more than the Tsarist regime of Russian domination in a fancy red trench coat. But that knowledge does come with a fair bit of hindsight. The situation in Ukraine, therefore, from 1922 onwards became far more complicated as these two processes collided, often with incredible violence. In Soviet Ukraine, the prevailing political situation became best described as national communism, a term that is very often used by the author Serhiy Plokhy with great effect. A national project for a Ukrainian state as a communist society, keeping its Ukrainian identity within a greater union of other Soviet socialist republics. At least that was the idea. Perhaps under Lenin there may have been a chance that this would have been a successful enterprise, maybe even mimicking the agreement that Klemensky made with the Tsar all those years ago. However, in 1924 he was dead, and in a few short years Joseph Stalin would have total control over the Soviet Union, and for Stalin, regional autonomy was not a conversation he was willing to maintain. On the other side of the border, you had another completely different situation, and that was a Polish minority attempting to stamp down on the nationalist surge from what was a briefly independent Western Ukraine. The nationalists with tacit support against those who were at odds with the Poles and other groups. See, we have reached a horrific part of history, a part of history that is mired in propaganda, and this is where the chickens are coming home to roost. Habsburg Austria had stood up and provided the Ukrainians with a voice, but this was done in order to silence the Poles, and the Poles were not even slightly ready to let this go. And given Poland had taken Lviv and the surrounding region, the nationalist Ukrainians also refused to let it go. We were on the collision course between two cultural groups who had been played against each other by larger powers. In December 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic signed a four-party agreement with the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, and the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Yes, that was a mouthful. But the decision was directly against the wishes of Stalin, who had become the party general secretary, a role at which the time did not hold the level of power that it soon would. See, Stalin wanted these smaller republics to join with the Russian Soviet Republic as a subject with extremely limited autonomy, viewing their flair for independence as a risk to the very future of the USSR. Lenin, however, supported the idea of a Ukrainian state within the state, of course subjected by Moscow with limited autonomy. He didn't, however, do this out of any kind of love, rather than the idea in mind that the future Soviet Socialist republics could be added, perhaps a Polish Soviet Socialist Republic, or a German Soviet Socialist Republic in future, forming a greater USSR. The Ukrainian communists liked this idea, and the national communists within the party leadership in Ukraine saw the revolution, therefore, as an avenue for social and national liberation. The party adopted the language of Ukrainian within Ukraine, a radical change, but interestingly, the peasant population in rural areas of Ukraine remained largely outside of the party, containing communism in practice within the cities, not within the rural people. The National Communists, upon the death of Lenin, therefore, found themselves petitioning for the further Ukrainization back to the Ukrainian language, reversing the policies of the Tsars of old and reigniting a national spirit. Stalin, he refused to entertain this, let alone remove Lazar Kagnovich, like the party members had wished during this period. And further to this, he actually pushed back against the use of the Ukrainian language as the Ukrainian SSR's lingua franca. Stalin began to become a bit of a nemesis, therefore, to the national communists and the nationalists in Ukraine. Another Tsar, attempting to force Ukrainian culture away, along with the language. Ukrainian activists saw which way the winds were blowing, and in short order, they began to distance themselves from Moscow, or in some cases get as far away from what they saw as looming prosecution as possible. Although Stalin, in a complete 180, he decided to take the initiative away from the Ukrainian National Communists, and he ordered Kagnovich himself to lead the drive for Ukrainization, with the tactical goal of keeping the Ukrainian ambitions in check. See, Stalin believed that Ukraine was not a country, let alone its own culture, and that in order for the great Russian culture to survive, Ukrainian culture would have to be put out to pasture, eventually. But by controlling the narrative and controlling the spread of Ukrainian ideals, Stalin, and by proxy Moscow, would have their foot on the throat of any future Ukrainian national movements. In 1929, therefore, when the first show trials began to take place in Kharkiv, the state was well placed to begin a purge of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, with the guise that the state was merely purging the great power chauvinism of the past. It will therefore come as no shock to anyone that this kind of standard was never employed in Russia itself, and that in reality the show trials were merely a one-way purge to get rid of the Ukrainians who would be at the forefront of the national drive of a homeland through communism. On the other side of the border, in many ways the conflict was much more cut and dry, but also incredibly complicated. The Poles ruled a territory with a population of around 5 million, of which in some areas the majority was Ukrainian. The Polish constitution and the treaties signed by the Polish government highlighted a guarantee of equality, stating that Ukrainian schools would be protected and that the language and culture would be given an equal standing along with the ruling Polish culture. In reality, both the Poles and Ukrainians held an immense amount of animosity towards each other, a leftover from the Polish-Ukrainian War in the early days of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The Polish state was new, though, and highly unstable, ruling over a large territory. The policy of the government, therefore, was to forcefully assimilate the new minorities in Poland into the new state in order to reinforce the new state's stability. Although we are only talking about Ukraine and Ukrainians here, given that this is, well, the history of Ukraine, it's worth noting that there were other such groups within this Polish state, such as Germans and Belarusians. This sadly was the reality for many of these new republics, finding themselves out in the cold, the borders unnaturally set from years at war and lacking a strong base to build their new states. In 1924, the so-called Lex Grabski was introduced. Now this was a series of laws named for the future Minister of Education, and it restricted the rights of Ukrainians, their language, and their teaching institutions. Ukrainians in response began a boycott of all Polish services along with the census and the elections. Language again became the front line in a war for Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian culture's future, with the literacy rate in Ukrainian dropping to 59% from 65% in just a few short years. The Polonization of Galicia would continue well into the 1930s, with fewer and fewer Ukrainian schools opening and ethnic Poles being given precedence when new teaching jobs were offered. The Polish state would further encourage migration by ethnic Poles into the region, breaking up the previous estates held together by former landowners, who themselves in many cases were Polish. Now on paper this meant that the Polish landowners lost out and the Ukrainian peasants lucked in. But the Polish government introduced a new law, giving Polish veterans the first chance at the new lands in what was now being dubbed Little Poland. This period proved to be the final straw for many of the Galician Ukrainians, who decided at this point to emigrate, heading across the Atlantic to Canada and the United States, amongst other countries forming the basis of now thriving communities abroad. Some even found their way into rural Australia. The situation in Galicia would further deteriorate as the decades passed and the Polish government focused less and less on the region's industry. The oil extraction dropped by 70%, for example, and less attention was provided to the east, as compared to the wealthy Polish west. As time passed, the east of the Polish state became less and less prosperous as a whole, with the Western Territory receiving the lion's share of government support and investment. During all of this, the Jews of Poland began to make the choice to migrate, be it to the Americas or the British Mandate of Palestine. For those who remained behind in Western Ukraine, they had enough of the situation, and came to the conclusion that the only way forward was again for an independent Ukrainian state. But it was clear to them now that nobody else could be relied on, that this new state would have to be fought for by themselves. Within this territory, therefore, a party with deep pre-war roots known as the National Democratic Alliance stepped into the void, and in 1929 it renamed itself the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, also known as the OUN. This organization shared the common goal of Ukrainian independence, but unlike the past, parts of the OUN were much more willing to use increasingly violent tactics to achieve their goal, whatever the cost. Across the border, though, the situation in Soviet Ukraine as the 1920s rolled into the 1930s saw the government under Stalin setting about enacting the first 5-year plan towards industrialization, notably collectivizing the farms. We have finally reached a downward spiral into genocide. We have reached the Holodomor. There are some important historical contexts as we go forward. I mentioned this at the start, but it was not nearly until the fall of the Soviet Union that the extent of the horror that we are about to cover began to be known. And this is when Gorbachev himself actually admitted that it happened. The Soviet government went to immense lengths to cover up and hide its actions. Just knowing where the graves were enough to get you killed, something the entire staff of the Lukyanivsky cemetery in Kyiv discovered when they were rounded up and executed on trumped-up charges in 1938. Today, politicians argue back and forwards about whether or not this was merely an accident or a genocide, politicians changing their points of view depending on what narrative they are pressing on any given day. Amongst historians, though, there is little doubt that the Holodomor was a deliberate act initiated by Stalin to use the dire situation that the 5-year plan created to get rid of his perceived threat of nationalist dissent in Ukraine. Similarly to Hitler, Stalin never gave a direct order. He never said, "Starve them," using instead euphemisms. But the events and the death, well, the death speaks for itself. A further common trope that is brought up is, well, Russians died too. Yes, that is true. Kazakhs as well. However, the figures again do not lie, and context is important, it matters. Over 10 times the amount of Ukrainians died in this period when compared to Russians. This is before we even take into the context that the areas hit hardest in Russia during the Holodomor were ethnically full of Ukrainians, namely regions surrounding Ukraine such as Rostov and Belgorod, in some cases regions that were part of the Ukrainian People's Republic before the Bolshevik invasion. Stalin went out of his way to deny aid to Ukraine even when the party leaders demanded and begged him to do so, even while regions outside of Ukraine received aid. And lastly, there is the simple fact that on the 1st of January 1933, Stalin gave the order to the party demanding that it enforce without prejudice the orders from 1932. This order that made hiding food for your own consumption an executable offense. Denial of the Holodomor comes from nothing more than a lack of education. If you want to know more, much more than I am about to say, I recommend you read the book Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, along with her other book Gulag. I would like to thank a lovely Ukrainian follower of mine for sending me a signed copy of Gulag. There will be further references in the description of this video. I encourage you to check them out, to read, to educate yourself. Up until this point, farms in Ukraine had largely been engaged in what we would call subsistence farming. Notably, this is the act of growing as much food as was necessary for the farmers to continue living on that particular bit of land, very much in the same way that centuries of inhabitants from the region had lived. Stalin intended to collectivize these individual farms into larger, collective farms, in which machinery would further increase their output. At least that was the idea. These new farms would belong solely to the Soviet state, which was now also the only legal purchaser of farm goods, most notably grain. Stalin didn't account for the fact that there would be resistance against this process because, shockingly, people who don't own many things don't want to give up every possession they own. You may remember earlier when I mentioned that communism had not taken complete control in the regional areas. Well, this is an example of it coming to roost. In response to their possessions being seized, many farmers in protest burned their fields and slaughtered livestock, in the hope that the shock to the industry and other industries such as leather and wool would stop the government from introducing the change. Keep in mind, when a cow dies, it's not just the food industry that takes a hit, it is also the leather industry, it's the furniture industry, it's everything that relies on what that cow's produce goes into. Stalin was furious at this protest from the wealthier peasants, known as kulaks. For the 5-year plan to work, the Soviets would need to liquidate what they saw as the problem of the kulaks. But what exactly is a wealthy peasant? It sounds like an anachronism. For the Soviets, this term became highly flexible. You could simply be considered a kulak and be up for liquidation because you owned 2 cows and your neighbor had 1. A way to determine someone being a kulak was if they had more cattle than someone else. The term kulak would then be applied to peasants who wouldn't hand over all their grain, including those keeping food for themselves. In 1929, the warning signs of a kulak was published by official government sources, and it listed the signs of somebody being a kulak as someone who made a little extra money through trade or anything else, or somebody that owned some kind of machinery or special equipment, such as a tannery. Even hiring outside labor would have you considered a kulak. Moscow therefore set the policy that the Gulag question would have to be settled, and this was by the secret police through the implementation of quotas and the increasing of anti-Gulag rhetoric, likening those who were deemed to be kulaks to bandits from the old White Army from the Russian Civil War, stating that they were not only class enemies but also enemies of the state, allowing for the seizure of homes, food, even clothes. I want you to stop and consider the rhetoric being portrayed by the Russian state media today that Ukrainians are all neo-Nazis, all evil. It terrifyingly mirrors the propaganda of the day that kulaks were all evil, were all against the USSR, even though the propaganda is very clearly targeted on ethnic lines. The Ukrainian Holodomor Museum in Kyiv has a display, a very simple one on the topic of collectivization, and it is simply just a woman's scarf. It isn't particularly fancy or worth a lot of money, it's actually quite simple, but the story behind it was that a Ukrainian peasant family found themselves one day being collectivized by the state. Before the police came and took everything, the mother stuffed the scarf inside her child's clothing. For the remainder of their lives, this scarf stood as a reminder of, in the family's words, the last time they were together and happy as a family, a time before what was coming next. The Soviets would remove in total some 2 million kulaks from Ukraine, often forcing them into the rural regions of Russia, including Siberia. Sometimes relocation would result in simply being dumped into the wilderness, left to die in the winter with no food, supplies, or shelter. In many ways, the liquidation of the kulaks was the genocide before the genocide, a targeted attack and a cleansing of a particular group within Ukrainian society. The region of Ukraine, in particular the steppe, is not one that is unfamiliar to drought. In fact, it is one of the key reasons that later Soviet building projects would focus on major dams, such as the Novokakhovka Dam that Russia blew up recently. In 1931, Ukraine found itself in a state of drought, and in response, the Soviet government demanded that the grain quotas, already impossible even in a period of perfect weather, had to be met. The Soviets needed the grain from the collective farms to export to buy foreign goods from the West to make the 5-year plan possible, grain being one of the only ways the Soviets could receive hard currency from foreign powers to purchase these goods. To increase these exports, Stalin demanded that the export of grain be forced, that the people would simply just have to provide more. In 2 years, Stalin would have the grain export increased by over 30-fold, and by 1931, the Soviet-appointed leader of Ukraine, Lazar Kagnovich, and the minister Vyacheslav Molotov, yes, the future foreign minister who signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, seeing how dire the situation was, began to recommend providing some kind of relief to Ukraine, as they highlighted it was likely Ukraine would experience at best a small famine in 1932. Stalin and the Central Committee did approve a small amount of food relief to be sent, but only to the cities such as Odessa and Kyiv. The surrounding rural areas would have to provide, or they would simply starve. In the summer of 1932, it became known that of the 600 districts in Ukraine, only 20 would be able to expect any kind of relief. The export of grain would then be further enforced, with Ukrainian officials being told that they were now personally responsible for any failures. As written in Red Famine by Applebaum, this was a crucial point in which Stalin decided that the local Ukrainian party members could no longer be trusted due to their pushback against his larger and ever-growing impossible quotas, and demands that they would be forced out of office completely, ending the very idea of national communism, started in the not-so-recent past. It is now 1932. Let us just recap what happened before we move forward. In the late 1920s, the Soviet Central Committee under Stalin has ordered the farms to be collectivized. In response, the wealthier landowners have protested. The Soviet state, wanting to implement the 5-year plan, have responded to this protest with mass deportations and killings of a significant part of the Ukrainian agricultural society, particularly those with the know-how to make these farms work. Stalin and the USSR, needing exports to fund industrialization, order the grain exports raised from already impossible levels. Drought begins to set into the Ukrainian SSR. The Soviet state effectively refuses aid to all but 20 districts in Ukraine. Local officials have also now been told that they will suffer if the export demands are not met. This includes the local police force. It is now summer in 1932. In November and December that year, the Soviets began to introduce further policies to assist with the requisition of food. The blackboards started to be posted around the country, listing the farms that were falling behind, along with a ban on the trade between these farms of any meat, farming equipment, and workers if they did not meet their quotas. This was then extended to flour, seeds, and on pain of death, and imprisonment enforced by police. It was known by the state that most of the farms by this point were underperforming due to drought, a lack of workers, and of course a lack of food. This was a death sentence for many of the farm workers. This is the point in which the death by hunger began. This was the beginning of the Holodomor. By this point, the people had no chance, no hope. Those who could resorted to eating dogs, cats, family pets, insects. Some boiled leather and ate it. Grass too. There were cases of cannibalism, but there was just not enough. Not enough of anything for anyone. People began to starve. At first slowly, then faster. Children too, their skin described as turning to yellow, then black, stretching across their frail bodies. Being unable to lift their heads that hung like sacks of corn around their frail necks. This would be the fate of adults too, as well as the old, the sick, and the infirm. On the roads in and out of the Donbass and in the streets of Kharkiv, the bodies of the people lay simply where they fell, the people too weak to move, the smell suffocating the streets around them, the people who lived there having no choice but to simply just get on with it and deal with it. You may ask now why the Ukrainian people didn't resist. Why didn't they fight back? Maria Zhubia from Poltava said it plainly. How could we resist when we had no strength to go outside? One Soviet official on the train from Kyiv opened his lunchbox to find mouldy bread and off butter. He threw it from the window of his car only to be approached by a woman broken at the sight asking him why he threw away food. The starvation had reached a point where people's bodies simply could not handle digestion. So for those lucky few who found food, the one thing they needed, the act of eating would kill them. Hiroya Samia recalled that they once smelt a terrible stench coming from the wheat fields, and upon approaching, saw bodies of hungry people who had crawled in to eat the shafts of wheat, and then died, their stomachs too weak to process anything. Death was everywhere. There was no escape. The sister of Volodymyr Slipchenko, a teacher of what we would dub a primary or elementary school, recalled the sight of young children slumped over their desks, dying midway through their lessons from the strain. Of children playing games outside in the grass with each other only for one to fall over dead from exhaustion. Their friends having no choice but to continue on, not having the chance to stop, to grieve. One woman recalled a young girl so emancipated that she became fixated on seeing the little girl's beating heart through her chest, so frail was her body. Families would break down with extreme cases of infanticide and parricide as people slowly lost their minds through hunger, resorting to even more desperate measures to simply stay alive. The Soviet government would further demand quotas. Those who didn't meet them would have their milling wheels smashed, removing the chance to even mill acorns and bark into a crude gruel to subside on. A later Soviet war correspondent, Vasily Grossman, explained it clearly that his village was ordered to fulfill a quota that would not have been possible even in a decade, let alone a year. And if you failed, then according to the state, you yourself were simply a kulak, and therefore you forfeited your rights. In March 1933, the Kremlin closed the borders to Ukraine, sealing it off from the rest of the USSR, providing food aid to regions outside of the Ukrainian SSR, and leaving the people inside to die. Resistance to these policies, to this hunger, was anti-Soviet and anti-revolutionary. The Soviet government forcefully shut down Ukrainian newspapers, education centres and cultural groups both inside Ukraine, but also within the Northern Caucasus, an area with an immensely large Ukrainian population and once a part of the Ukrainian People's Republic, taking advantage of this cruel famine enacted by their own policies to destroy the Ukrainian identity. The state, in a cruel twist, began to reward those who told on their neighbours with just enough scraps to survive. People turned on one another, handing in their neighbours for made-up crimes just to keep their children alive. Some gave in to psychosis, abandoning their homes and their families, leaving them to die because the groans and the cries were unbearable. Of course, suicide occurred. It was not uncommon. Not in the slightest. Of course, the people tried to flee the countryside, trying to get into the cities for food, but the Soviet state ordered them back into their village to die at gunpoint, knowing full well most would simply not make it and add to the growing pile of bodies on the side of the road. For those already in the cities, empathy was in short supply. Witnesses in Mariupol recall a young girl begging for crumbs of bread from those fortunate enough to be in a breadline. The shopkeeper running the breadline, seeing this girl begging, accused her of being a lazy enemy of the people for not working, and he kicked her to death right there in the street. She was all of 15. This man refused to speak Ukrainian, and when the people around him wept, he simply retorted with how they were enemies of the USSR, and those enemies were everywhere, and that these people were simply too sentimental. The official position of the party and Stalin was that those who were starving were not victims, rather it was their own fault. Had they just fallen in line and provided the grain that was demanded, the impossible demand, then they wouldn't be starving. According to him, they deserved to die. In all, 4.5 million people are estimated to have died from starvation. 3.7 to 3.9 million of these deaths taking place in Ukraine alone, many others in areas of Soviet Russia with large Ukrainian populations. It would be further criminal to ignore the horrors enforced on the native Kazakhs in Central Asia, with similar policies taking place, killing 1/3 of all native Kazakh nomads, with resistance being crushed by the Red Army. The Soviets would go out of their way over the next 60 years to hide the extent of this genocide, lying, executing whistleblowers, and of course downplaying the effect. The life expectancy of Ukrainians speaks more for the effect of the Holodomor than anything else. In 1932, a rural Ukrainian had a life expectancy of roughly 42 years. For those born in 1933, the average life expectancy was 5. Just 5. In May 1933, the policies finally changed. The Kremlin approved food aid and moved away from the quota system for grain toward a taxation on total harvests. Arrests would also take a step back, purely down to the fact that the state wanted more manpower to work on its farms. A final reduction was given to the quotas in 1933, and it brought the horror, at last, to an end. In 1934, Stalin stood up to ravenous applause to the party and stated that the enemy had been defeated, that the kulaks had been liquidated, and to make no mistake, there were still more nationalists, more enemies, remaining with the goal of undermining the revolution and the USSR. This was simply a war by Stalin and Moscow against the Ukrainian people, and it was the innocent who paid the price. Never forget what the Kremlin did to Ukraine in 1933. In 1933, the cities and the leadership knew the villages were dying. The evidence and the smell was everywhere. Letters were even going to the Kremlin stating that even in starvation, the peasants were simply not getting the message. Unlike an earlier famine in 1921 in which the Soviet state requested and received foreign aid, this time the official position of the state was that there was no famine. There was only, and I quote, sickness from malnutrition. The state went out of its way to cover its tracks, with one Red Army soldier from Ukraine having joined in 1934, after surviving the famine himself, being threatened with 10 years in prison for daring to ask a question about it. Ukrainian soldiers abroad during the famine found that one day in 1933, quite often letters just stopped arriving, and after they made their way home in 1934 and onwards, they found that their families had simply disappeared, with nobody willing to relive and explain the horror as to why they were gone on pain of death. In rural areas, local bookkeepers and party officials were ordered to destroy the registries and documents hiding the death and missing parts of the population from the world. Even after the bodies had been swept into mass graves and dumped hidden out of sight, the Soviets still had the issue with the 1937 census, and it was bluntly ordered that they would not be published. None of the results from the census would be permitted to be republished. As far as the Soviet state was confirmed, there was no famine. If you spoke about a famine, you were an anti-revolutionary liar, liable to be shot or sent to hard labor. This was the position of the Soviet Union until Gorbachev admitted to the world that a famine had occurred. But it would not be until 2006 that the Holodomor was truly seen for what it was: a genocide. I hope this has helped in providing some much needed context into the Holodomor, along with some harrowing first-hand accounts. This is history that cannot be forgotten. To this day, Russia denies that the Holodomor occurred as a genocide, launching a smear campaign against Ukraine in 2006 when it formally recognized the genocide. And every now and then you will see a significant amount of Russian trolls and backed bots online denying the Holodomor's existence. The next episode will cover the lead up to the Second World War, along with the invasion of the USSR by Nazi Germany, and the operations of those in Ukraine who both collaborated with the German occupiers, along with a far larger group of Ukrainians who joined the Red Army to fight back against Hitler, fighting their way into Berlin itself. I don't want to give my usual self-promotion spiel here, it does not feel right to do. But I just want to thank you all for taking the time to listen, to become educated on a topic that for many of us is a world and eternity away. And I do want to particularly thank my patrons for making this possible. I simply ask that this year, on the final Saturday in November, you light a candle, you stop, you reflect, and you think. We grew up in the West understanding and knowing about the Holocaust, the horrific, unspeakable crime of which Germany today still feels shame. This is the great unrealized shame that Russia to this day denies and to this day continues to perpetrate against its neighboring, so-called brother nation. Nikoli near Zabuti.